He didn't ask for a weapon. He asked for a pen. The room went quiet in the way that large rooms go quiet when everyone present has just heard something that does not compute, and they are all waiting, collectively, for someone else to confirm that they heard it too. Commander Ithra Voss stood at the observation window above the selection floor and said nothing for 4 seconds. Then she said quietly, to no one in particular. He asked for a pen. Her aide, Lieutenant Corallan, checked the display. A standard graphite writing instrument, ma'am. Category: non-powered tools. Survival utility rating: negligible. Ithra watched the man below walk away from the selection table, the pen tucked behind his ear, and she felt something she had not felt in 11 years of administering the Ven-Shakar protocol. She genuinely did not know what was going to happen next. The Ven-Shakar protocol had been running for 190 years. It was the Interstellar Defense Coalition's most demanding field certification. Not the most prestigious, not the most decorated, but the one that separated the candidates who had trained for extreme environments from the candidates who had been built for them. The distinction mattered. Training could be replicated, certain kinds of capability could not. The format was deliberately brutal in its simplicity. A candidate was inserted alone into a designated crisis zone, a sealed decommissioned space station, a failing orbital platform, a dead colony installation with active environmental hazards, with no support, no communication uplink, and no extraction for 96 hours. Before insertion, each candidate was permitted to select survival and operational equipment from a standardized catalog of 120 items. The catalog had been curated over decades to represent the full range of Coalition emergency response technology. Atmospheric processors, structural repair systems, emergency medical units, powered exoskeleton suits, environmental hazard neutralizers, and approximately 40 additional categories of equipment that the Coalition's Engineering Corps had developed specifically for high-risk field operations. The record for the highest operational score belonged to a Dreshani field engineer who had selected 61 items, stabilized a failing reactor core in under 18 hours, and produced a full structural assessment of the installation by the time extraction arrived. Her score had stood for 23 years. In 190 years of the protocol, no candidate had selected fewer than 15 items. The human's name was Joran Alec Mace. He was 31 years old. His file listed him as a Level 2 systems maintenance technician from the outer settlement of Caldris Station, a mid-tier supply hub on the edge of Coalition-charted space where the infrastructure was old, the equipment budget was chronically underfunded, and the engineering staff kept things running through a combination of institutional memory, improvisation, and what his supervisor's annual review had diplomatically described as unconventional methodology. He had applied for the Ven-Shakar protocol through standard channels 14 months ago. The application had been accepted after a 9-month processing delay, in part because the Coalition's Evaluation Committee had needed to verify that his Level 2 certification was in fact sufficient to meet the minimum qualification threshold. It was barely. He had traveled to the protocol facility on Drevak Station at his own expense, because the Coalition's evaluation program covered travel expenses only for candidates from accredited Coalition installations, and Caldris Station's accreditation had lapsed 6 years ago due to an administrative filing error that no one had corrected because the station's administrative coordinator had been handling 4 other roles simultaneously, and the form had fallen to the bottom of a stack that, according to Joran's own account, had been repurposed as a doorstop. Commander Ithra had reviewed his file once before his arrival. She had not reviewed it twice because nothing in it suggested she would need to. Level 2 Technician, Outer Settlement, Unconventional Methodology. Nothing that suggested he was going to do what he was about to do. The selection floor of the Ven-Shakar protocol facility was a chamber 80 meters long, climate-controlled to a precise 22 degrees, with 120 catalog items arranged on a continuous illuminated display that curved around the room's interior wall. Every item had a catalog card detailing its specifications, power requirements, operational lifespan, and cross-referenced utility rating against the specific hazard profile of the designated crisis zone. The current assignment was Installation Keth 9, a decommissioned research platform in a decaying orbital path, with compromised atmospheric integrity in sectors 3 through 7, a cascading power failure in progress across the secondary grid, structural stress fractures in the central support column, and an active biohazard containment breach in Laboratory Section D that the environmental briefing described, with careful precision, as contained but deteriorating. Candidates typically spent between 3 and 8 hours on the selection floor. They cross-referenced catalog ratings against the hazard profile. They ran weight and load calculations. They built operational strategies, backup strategies, contingency frameworks. The Drashani record holder had reportedly spent 11 hours on selection alone and had arrived at her 61-item loadout through a process her post-assessment interview described as systematic elimination. Joran Maisie spent 22 minutes on the selection floor. He walked the full length of the display at a measured, unhurried pace, hands in his jacket pockets, reading each catalog card with the focused, slightly distracted attention of a man browsing a hardware store for something he already knows they probably don't carry. He paused twice, once at the atmospheric processors, once at the structural repair systems. Both times he looked at the item, looked at the catalog rating, and moved on without touching the selection register. At the far end of the display, in the section labeled Non-Powered Supplementary Tools, he stopped. He picked up the item. He read the catalog card, which listed it as Graphite Writing Instrument Standard Pressure-Rated Casing, approved for use in vacuum-proximate environments. Survival Utility Rating, Negligible. He pressed his palm to the selection register. The display updated. Selection complete. 1 of 120 items chosen. The floor assistant, a young coalition officer on her 3rd month of protocol duty, looked at the display, looked at Joran, and then looked back at the display, in the manner of someone who has just read a message and is checking whether the screen has developed a malfunction. Joran tucked the pen behind his ear and walked toward the insertion prep area. In the observation gallery above, Commander Ithara Voss said, "He asked for a pen," and Lieutenant Corlin, who was already pulling up the regulations to check whether a candidate could be stopped at this stage, found the relevant clause, read it twice, and said, "We can't stop him, ma'am. Selection is complete and binding." Ithara watched Joran disappear through the prep room door. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to stop him." A pause. "I want to see this." Installation Keth 9 was, by objective measurement, a bad situation getting worse on a fixed schedule. The platform had been operational for 34 years as a coalition research installation, before budget consolidation had moved its functions to a newer facility and left Keth 9 in an unmaintained orbital decay. The decommissioning team had performed a standard shutdown, which meant they had properly secured the primary systems and improperly accounted for the secondary grid interaction with the orbital drift, a failure that had become apparent 18 months later when the secondary grid had begun drawing from the emergency power reserves to compensate for load imbalance. By the time the Protocol Evaluation Committee had designated Keth 9 as a training site, the cascading failure was already 3 years in progress, and the structural stress fractures had been catalogued as non-critical but advancing. The biohazard breach in Laboratory D had occurred 6 months ago, when the containment field lost power for 11 seconds during a grid fluctuation. The containment had re-established. The breach had not fully closed. The environmental briefing categorized the current situation as a slow-moving contamination expansion requiring intervention within 96 hours to prevent spread to the ventilation network. The monitoring teams had seeded the installation with 340 sensor nodes that fed continuous data to the observation center on Drevak Station. Every room, every corridor, every system state was visible in real time. The Protocol Evaluation Committee had never actually needed the sensors to rescue a candidate. The record for closest extraction call was a Pel-Ari engineer who had requested emergency pull at hour 81, but the monitoring was considered standard practice. Joran arrived at the insertion point, accepted his atmospheric suit check, mandatory regardless of equipment selection, and one of only 2 things candidates could not decline, confirmed his single item, and stepped through the insertion lock. The door sealed behind him. Commander Ithara at the main monitoring console watched him emerge on the interior feed. He stood still for 45 seconds at the insertion corridor junction, not moving, not checking his suit systems, not referencing any equipment. He was simply looking. His eyes moved across the corridor walls, the ceiling, the conduit runs visible behind the damaged paneling, the status lights on the corridor junction box. He turned slowly in a full circle. Then he took the pen from behind his ear. He found a clear surface on the wall of the corridor, a section of emergency placard frame that had lost its sign. He wrote on the metal backing, not words, a diagram, small, precise, drawn in the measured strokes of someone who was not sketching but recording. He studied it for a moment, made 2 additions, and put the pen back behind his ear. He walked toward Sector 3. Corlin, watching the feed, said quietly, "He's mapping." "From what?" Ithara asked. From the conduit runs, Corlin said. He's reading the conduit layout to determine where the power is still flowing. Ithara looked at the diagram Joran had drawn on the placard frame. It was too small to read clearly on the feed, but its structure was recognizable, a schematic. Not a copy of a schematic from any document. His own, built from observation. He hasn't been inside this installation before, she said. No, ma'am. She said nothing else for a moment then. Keep all sensor feeds active. Flag anything unusual. Corlin very carefully did not say that everything about this was already unusual. What followed was 96 hours that Commander Ithara reviewed in full, without segments, something she had never done in 11 years of protocol oversight, because the monitoring system flagged Joran's location for significant activity on an average of once every 3 hours, and each time the flag cleared, she found herself already watching the next sequence before the alert had finished processing. Hour 4. He had reached Sector 3, the first area with compromised atmospheric integrity. The breach was in a junction seal, slow leaking into the corridor beyond. The environmental briefing had rated it as a 4-hour exposure risk without atmospheric equipment. Joran spent 12 minutes examining the junction, the seal material, the surrounding conduit structure, and the thermal state of the corridor walls. He pulled 2 pieces of delaminated wall paneling from a section where the adhesive had failed. He removed the inner pressure lining from one, a dense, slightly elastic composite material, and used it to pack the junction gap. He pulled the conduit bracketing from a non-critical lighting run and used it to compress the packing material against the seal. The monitoring system's atmospheric sensor in that corridor registered stabilization within the hour. Corlin ran the repair against the catalog. The closest equivalent item, a portable atmospheric seal kit, was item 34 on the selection list. Catalog rating for the repair Joran had just performed using delaminated wall material and repurposed conduit bracketing. Not categorized. The catalog did not contain a category for this approach. Hour 11. Power grid. The secondary grid failure had created a cascading draw that was pulling the emergency reserves toward a critical threshold. If the draw was not interrupted, the emergency reserves would hit critical at approximately hour 60, cutting power to the containment field in Laboratory D and accelerating the biohazard breach from manageable to irreversible. The catalog offered 3 items capable of addressing this: a portable power management unit, an emergency grid isolation system, and a neural interface load balancer, items 7, 8, and 23 respectively. Joran had none of them. He spent 90 minutes at the secondary grid junction, studying the power flow with no instruments. He traced the conduit runs by hand, checking heat differential. He made notes on the wall near the junction panel, a running schematic that by hour 11 covered approximately 3 square meters of corridor wall in compact notation. Then he did something that the monitoring team had to replay 3 times to understand. He identified 2 junction nodes that were in an inadvertent feedback loop, each drawing from the other's compensating output in a cycle that was amplifying the overall load. He physically broke the connection on one node using a section of non-conductive conduit shielding he had removed from a low-priority lighting run. Then he rerouted the load manually across 3 alternative pathways using the emergency bypass switches that existed in the grid architecture for precisely this scenario, but that no candidate had ever used because every candidate had brought the equipment that made them unnecessary. The cascading draw stopped. The emergency reserve stabilized. Corlin pulled up the grid engineering specifications for Keth 9 and found the bypass switch documentation in a technical appendix, Section 7, Subsection 4, noted as Legacy Emergency Provision. He knew about the bypass switches, Corlin said. Did he have access to the Keth 9 technical files before insertion? Ithara asked. Corlin checked. No, ma'am. Candidates don't receive installation-specific technical documentation. Only the environmental briefing and the hazard profile. A pause. He found them, Ithara said. He found a legacy provision in Section 7 of a technical subsystem document he wasn't given. Corlin looked at the feed by reading the physical architecture of the grid. Ithara was quiet for a moment. Keep watching. Hour 19. The structural stress fractures in the central support column. The catalog offered a structural repair system. Item 2. The heaviest and most powerful tool in the selection catalog, capable of injecting composite bonding material into fractures under pressure and providing immediate load transfer support. Joran had a pen. He spent 2 hours doing something that initially appeared to be nothing. He walked the central column in a systematic grid pattern, pressing his hand flat against the surface at intervals of approximately half a meter, stopping and writing in his notation system on the nearest wall. He worked in silence methodically with the patience of a man who was not in a hurry because he had already decided on his approach, and the approach required patience. What he was producing, the monitoring team eventually realized, was a stress map. A physical assessment of the fracture distribution, determined by pressure differential on the surface, where the column flexed under hand pressure and where it did not, which indicated where the fractures had progressed, and where the structural integrity remained solid. Armed with this assessment, he identified 4 locations where temporary load transfer could be achieved not by injecting bonding material, but by redistributing the mechanical load path. He spent 3 hours constructing load transfer braces from decommissioned equipment frames in a nearby storage corridor. Heavy, awkward, designed for a completely different purpose, repurposed with a functionality that their manufacturers had never specified or tested. The structural analysis system in the monitoring center fed the sensor data from the column, registered a reduction in stress concentration at the primary fracture points. Corlin said nothing for a long time after that. Hour 34, the biohazard breach in Laboratory D. This was the most critical hazard on the installation, and the one the monitoring team had been watching with the most concern. The containment protocol required either a powered containment field restoration, which needed Item 7 or Item 15 from the catalog, or a physical barrier installation to prevent further spread through the ventilation network, which required Items 44 through 51, the Hazard Barrier Toolkit. Joran stood at the sealed entry to Laboratory D for 31 minutes without entering. He read the status panels beside the door. He read the ventilation network schematic that was mounted as a safety diagram on the corridor wall, the kind of diagram that is placed there for emergency evacuation purposes, and that no previous candidate had ever had reason to study carefully, because they all had equipment that made the ventilation layout irrelevant. He entered the lab wearing his atmospheric suit, which provided protection against the current contamination level, just barely, and with a margin that the monitoring team found uncomfortable to watch, but that technically fell within operational parameters. Inside, he spent 20 minutes assessing the breach point. He did not touch the containment equipment. He examined the ventilation intake, the airflow patterns based on the visible particulate movement, and the structural relationship between the breach and the ventilation entry point. Then he built a physical barrier, not from the hazard barrier toolkit, from the lab's own internal architecture. He removed the equipment racking from the wall adjacent to the ventilation intake, 3 meters of heavy composite shelving, and used it in combination with the lab's own emergency blast shutters, which had partially deployed during the original incident and then frozen in a mid-position, due to the power fluctuation, to create a physical seal that was not airtight, but was sufficient to reduce the breach's spread rate below the threshold that would reach the main ventilation network within the 96-hour window. It was not a permanent solution. It was a 96-hour solution, which was exactly what the protocol required. The monitoring team's biohazard specialist spent an hour analyzing the improvised barrier before she said, to no one in particular, "That's actually sound. It's using the blast shutter's existing seal geometry. He's not fighting the architecture, he's completing it." Hour 61. The power reserves had stabilized. The atmospheric breach in Sector 3 was holding. The structural bracing was performing within acceptable parameters. The biohazard spread had slowed to a rate the specialist rated as manageable. Joran went back to the corridor near the secondary grid junction and spent 4 hours writing. Not diagrams this time. Dense, organized text in his compact notation covering the wall space he had been accumulating across the installation. The monitoring team zoomed the feed on the wall nearest the junction and was able to read fragments, technical assessments, failure progression timelines, recommended intervention priorities for each system, notes on the specific properties of the materials he had repurposed and why they had been appropriate, observations about the grid architecture that the Keth-9 technical team had apparently never documented. He was writing a maintenance report on the walls of the installation, in pen. Athara looked at the feed for a long time without speaking. Hour 89. He walked the full installation one more time in a systematic sweep, checking each of his interventions, verifying that nothing had shifted or degraded. He made small adjustments in 2 places. Tightened the conduit bracketing on the Sector 3 atmospheric seal, rechecked the position of one load transfer brace on the central column. He made notes after each check. At hour 93, he returned to the insertion corridor and sat down with his back against the wall, facing the corridor junction where he had drawn his first schematic 93 hours ago. The schematic was still there. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took out the pen and added several items to it. Updates, corrections, things he had learned about the installation's architecture during the 93 hours since he had first drawn it. He put the pen back behind his ear. He waited. Joran walked out of the installation at hour 96 and 7 minutes. Through the extraction lock into the Drevak station receiving bay, carrying nothing except his atmospheric suit and the pen behind his ear. Commander Ithara was waiting at the receiving bay herself. She had told Corallan it was standard practice for the commanding officer to meet candidates at extraction. Corallan, who had been working under Ithara for 3 years and had never seen her meet a candidate at extraction before, said nothing. Joran was wearing 96 hours of Keth9 on his suit and his face. There was chemical residue on his gloves from the barrier construction. He looked like a man who had been inside a failing space station for 4 days doing the work of a full engineering team with a pen. He looked at Commander Ithara. She looked at him. It was the right one, he said. His voice was even, without performance, not modest, not proud. Simply factual. The record, she said, is 61 items. 23 years. Full reactor stabilization in 18 hours. Joran reached into his suit's interior pocket and produced a folded section of material, the inner pressure lining from the wall paneling he had used in Sector 3, the side that faced inward where the surface was smooth. He had been writing on it for the last 20 hours of the assessment. He unfolded it on the surface beside him. It covered an area roughly equivalent to 4 sheets of standard documentation paper and was filled on both sides with dense, organized notation. Atmospheric seal failure in Sector 3, failure mechanism, repair methodology, material properties, long-term durability estimate, and recommended permanent fix for the Keth9 maintenance log, he said, pointing to the first section. Secondary grid cascade. Failure origin in the feedback loop between nodes 7 and 12, corrective bypass routing, legacy provision documentation reference, and a note that the bypass architecture is not included in the current Keth9 technical documentation set, which is probably why the failure went unaddressed in the decommissioning process. He turned the material over. Structural fractures, distribution map, stress concentration points, load transfer brace specifications and placement rationale, estimated time to failure without permanent intervention, and recommended repair sequencing for a qualified structural team. Laboratory D biohazard breach. Containment approach, spread rate reduction from pre-intervention to post-intervention. Barrier material specifications, durability window, and a note about the blast shutter geometry that the original installation engineers probably did not account for but should be considered in the permanent containment restoration. He set the material down. I also found a water reclamation line in Sector 5 that's been leaking into the structural cavity for an estimated 4 years. It's not in the hazard profile. It's contributing to the stress fractures. You'll want to fix that first, before the structural repair, or the repair won't hold. A pause. I wrote it on the wall near the Sector 5 junction. There wasn't room on here. Ithara looked at the material. She looked at Joran. She looked at the material again. Where, she said, with the deliberate care of a woman choosing her words precisely. Did you learn to read a power grid by hand pressure and heat differential? Joran looked at her with the calm, direct attention of a man who has been waiting for a question like this for a long time. Caldra Station runs about 60% of standard coalition maintenance budget, he said. Has for about 12 years. The diagnostic equipment breaks down. The replacement parts take 8 to 14 weeks to arrive. The station doesn't stop running while we wait. He paused. You learn to read the system the way the system presents itself. You use what's there. You stop thinking about what's supposed to be there and start thinking about what actually is. Ithara was quiet for a long moment. The Protocol Review Board meets in 2 weeks, she said. I know, Joran said. He showed no particular reaction to this. I want you to present your assessment to them. The full documentation. The grid findings in particular, the legacy bypass provision issue needs to be added to the Coalition Infrastructure Review Program. No one caught that. She stopped. She looked at the material on the surface, then at the pen behind his ear. Why the pen? She said. Of all the items, why only the pen? Joran looked at her steadily. Because everything else on that list assumes the problem is fixed once the equipment handles it, he said. The pen assumes the problem isn't finished until it's understood. A pause that carried in it 12 years of working on a station where the budget was never enough, and the equipment was never quite right, and the only thing that had kept it running was the knowledge that accumulated in the people who stayed. Documentation outlasts the emergency. Understanding outlasts the tool. I already know which one you actually need. Athara was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up the folded material from the surface. She opened it. She read the first entry. Atmospheric Seal Sector 3, Failure Mechanism. Written in the compact, precise hand of a man who had made his first assessment within the first 2 hours of insertion. Before he had resolved any of the hazards, she looked up. "I'm also going to contact Caldra Station," she said. "Their accreditation lapsed 6 years ago over an administrative filing error." "I know," Joran said. "The form is in the station director's third desk drawer. It's been filled out for 4 years. No one told him where to send it." Athara looked at him. "I'll tell him where to send it," she said. Joran nodded once, with the composure of a man who had walked into a failing space station with a pen, and was now watching the institutions that had overlooked him for a decade begin, one small correction at a time, to catch up. He took the pen from behind his ear, turned it once in his fingers, and tucked it back. Then he walked toward the station exit at the same unhurried pace he had carried through 96 hours of installation Keth 9, the pace of someone who had never needed to run, because they had already been thinking 3 hours ahead. Commander Athara watched him go. She stood at the receiving bay for a moment longer than necessary. Then she picked up her comm unit and placed 3 calls, one to the Protocol Review Board to schedule the emergency session, one to the Coalition Infrastructure Program to flag the Keth 9 grid documentation failure, and one to the Administrative Processing Office to locate the Caldra Station accreditation file and determine what it would take to get it processed before the end of the month. The folded pressure lining material sat on the surface beside her, both sides covered, dense, organized, precise. One pen, 96 hours, and more useful intelligence about a failing installation than the Coalition's own decommissioning team had produced in 3 years of watching it deteriorate from a distance.